And hello, I'm Arcega in Washington. Welcome to the Correspondents on Voice of America. Well, we have a busy lineup today. Up first, the deteriorating situation in Syria. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry says that if a ceasefire deal to end the civil war in Syria is to be salvaged, warplanes must first stop flying over key parts of that country. His comments came this week during a high-level meeting of the United Nations Security Council. We'll have more now from VOA's Margaret Bashir in New York.
The United States and Russia agreed to a cessation of hostilities on September 9th, but two deadly incidents since then have tested its viability.
So I believe that to restore credibility to the process, we must move forward to try to immediately ground all aircraft flying in those key areas.
Kerry said a flight ban would also prevent the Syrian military attacking civilian targets with the excuse that it is going after armed groups and terrorists. The ban would also help build confidence toward restarting intra-Syrian talks.
How can people go sit at a table with a regime that bombs hospitals and drops chlorine gas again and again and again and again and again and again?
His Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, told the council that there are different versions of what happened to an aid convoy near Aleppo on Monday that resulted in 20 deaths.
We insist on a very thorough and impartial investigation of the attack on the humanitarian convoy.
So, when is a ceasefire not a ceasefire? To help us make sense of what's going on in Syria, we're joined on Skype by VOA Moscow Bureau Chief Daniel Schearf in Moscow. And joining me here in our Washington studio, we have VOA National Security Correspondent Jeff Seldin. I'm happy to have both of you gentlemen on the program. But Daniel, I'm going to start with you. On that attack on that humanitarian aid convoy in Aleppo, Lavrov says he wants a thorough and impartial investigation. But there's already evidence that Russian aircraft were actually flying in the area when that convoy was struck. Is Sergei Lavrov perhaps trying to suggest that some other group besides the Russians are responsible for this attack?
Yes, from the beginning, Sergei Lavrov had made comments indicating that Russia was not responsible, Syria was not responsible. Russia's defense ministry came out with statements saying that there were rebels operating in the area and that they believe that they were responsible for attacking the aid convoy from the ground. The U.S. military, of course, and its allies have said that there were two Russian planes in the area, that this was clearly a bombing that took place, and it was either Syria or Russia. And U.S. officials have been making it clear that they are leaning towards Russia being responsible for this because of the fact that it took place at night. Yes, sorry, go ahead.
So denying responsibility, that's a political calculation on Russia's part?
Well, denying responsibility is something that Russia does in these cases. If they're being accused of something, then deny. It's
right.
Something that goes back to Soviet times, and then they're also looking to try and direct attention in other ways, saying that the rebels may be responsible. Russia's defense ministry also has made a statement that a U.S. Predator drone was in the area, right. And although they weren't pointing at that, they were clearly, trying to point the suspicion away from themselves.
So, Jeff, as you heard, typical MO among the Russian military here. But you're saying that some U.S. military officials suggest that this attack on that convoy in Aleppo is one of the reasons why you can't really trust sharing intelligence information with the Russians. Can you expand on that?
Well, it goes much, much deeper than that. The U.S. military, even during the initial stages of the negotiations for the cessation of hostilities between Kerry and Lavrov, seemed to be the partner in part of the whole scheme of the negotiations that was reluctant to move forward with some of what the deal suggested. Remember, part of that deal calls for the establishment of a joint integration center, what they're calling the JIC, which would allow the U.S. to share some information with the Russians to share some information with the United States, to continue targeting groups like Jabhat al-Nusra or Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, as it's now calling itself, Islamic State, other terrorist groups in the area, which, despite the cessation of hostilities, are still considered fair game in terms of targeting. And the U.S. military was sort of dragging its feet, we understand. because there's a deep distrust of what Russia is really up to. And now, in light of what happened with the aid convoy, and the top U.S. ranking military officer said just the other day at a congressional hearing, there is no doubt in his mind that Russia is responsible, whether it was the Russian planes that dropped the bombs or it was the Syrian planes. But he said that he indicated, and other military officials are also indicating, that they don't think there was ever any seriousness at this point on behalf of the Russians or the Assad regime in Syria to actually make good on any sort of ceasefire.
I've heard some of your analysts say this is also the reason, this distrust is also the reason why many are saying that this ceasefire agreement with Russia was doomed to fail in the first place.
Well, the complicated part about Syria, and you hear this from both military officials and members of the intelligence community, is that it's not necessarily about Syria, at least for Russia. Russia does have an interest in Syria. They do have a military footprint there. They wanted to protect their interests, and they've done that by backing the Assad regime. They've protected their military footprint in the country. They protected basically their last toehold in the Middle East.
Right.
But they've also been using Syria, military officials tell me, to basically boost their military sales, to use it to demonstrate their new weapons, which they've spent years now investing in, and they want to make some money off of it. And they've also used Syria to kind of boost their international prestige. As one U.S. intelligence official said this past week, they basically forced the U.S. to bring them to the table as equals.
It's like a showcase for Soviet military might, or Russian military might, I should say.
You say Soviet military might, but the intelligence community says that's a key part of what's going on here. To understand what Russia is doing, you need to understand Vladimir Putin. And they say, in a real sense, he wants to bring back the world in which he grew up, which was the Cold War era, when it was the U.S. against the Soviet Union. It was a bipolar world, and everybody knew if something was going to get done in terms of a peace agreement or something like that, you weren't going to be able to do it without having a Russian role.
Yeah, let's get Daniel's take on this. Perhaps you can expand on Jeff's point. Now, besides propping up the Assad regime, what else is Russia gained by getting involved in the Syrian conflict?
Well, from the beginning of Russia's involvement in this conflict a year ago, independent political analysts here in Moscow have said that it was a very cynical move on the Russian part to try and get itself to the big table with the United States, to be engaged in big discussions, and to show that it's a major world power once again that can negotiate head-to-head with the United States in the Middle East. Certainly, that is part of the strategy that we're seeing in terms of the Russians. They seem to really want to show that they are a big power once again. Vladimir Putin is very concerned about the image of his country and that it's shown the respect that he believes it deserves. And certainly, this is playing up domestically as well, because he gains the support of the country whenever he can show how tough Russia is and standing up to the West and so forth. So this is very much part of the tactic that he's been pursuing. Whether or not it's going to be in the long run successful is hard to say. But the Russian tactic of really trying to make facts on the ground, I think, is what we're seeing now in Syria with these increased airstrikes in the last 24 hours as the ceasefire very quickly fell apart.
Right.
It seems like the Syrian and Russian militaries are really trying to change the situation on the ground since they can't change it at the negotiating table.
Jeff, I'm out of time, but lastly, what happens to that image, that tough image of Russia, if this ceasefire fails?
Well, Russia, as Daniel mentioned, is very good about trying to create facts on the ground, and they're also very good at using instability.
But this could hurt them, right?
Well, yeah, there is a thought that they actually are somewhat embarrassed by this, because one of the things that they want to get out of Syria, the thought is to relieve the economic sanctions laid against them by what happened in Ukraine. And if they can't get a peace deal in Syria and they can't say to Europe, look, how we stop the migration crisis, they may have a harder time doing that.
Stick around, Jeff, because I'm going to need you for the second segment. My thanks to Daniel Schearf, who I wanted to talk about Russia's economy with, but we had no time. But it's time for a quick break, and when we come back, new information on the New Jersey and New York City bombings and what the Muslim community knew about the suspect. This is the Correspondents on Voice of America.